You're joking, right? A cleaning lady's salary wouldn't cover the wine we just ordered. Margaret Ashford laughed, and the crystal in her hand caught the candlelight like a blade. The words hit me like a bucket of ice water dropped straight down my spine. 31 years I had built something from nothing, and this woman, who had known me for 11 minutes, had already decided exactly what I was worth. But she had no idea that the woman she was mocking could have bought that entire restaurant and never noticed the dent in her account. I smiled, picked up my water glass, and said nothing at all. My name doesn't matter yet. What matters is what happened at that table and what I decided to do about it. But let me start from the beginning, because you deserve to understand exactly how much I gave before I ever thought about taking anything back. I am 68 years old. I have lived in the same modest brick house on Larchmont Avenue for 39 years, the house my husband Thomas and I bought when we had exactly $400 in savings and a baby boy who cried every night from 9 to midnight like clockwork. Thomas worked the floor at a machine parts plant for 22 years. I sewed curtains and reupholstered furniture out of our garage to make ends meet, because back then, a factory foreman's salary and a young family did not leave much room for anything extra. We ate a lot of rice and beans in those years. We patched the same coats for 3 winters running. I remember standing in the kitchen one January, counting out quarters from a mason jar to buy Nathan a pair of boots that fit, and Thomas coming in from a double shift, snow still on his shoulders, telling me not to worry, that we'd figure it out, that we always figured it out. We did. That was the whole of our philosophy, really. Figure it out. Quietly, without complaint, without asking anyone for a hand we hadn't earned. I am not telling you this to complain. I am telling you this because it is the soil that everything else grew out of, and you cannot understand the woman who sat at that restaurant table in a faded cardigan without first understanding the woman who once counted quarters from a mason jar to keep her son's feet warm. What nobody in my family knows, not my son, not his wife, not a single person who has sat at my modest kitchen table and eaten my pot roast, is that the little upholstery business I started in that garage in 1987 became something else entirely. It began the way most small things begin, almost by accident. A neighbor 2 streets over admired the curtains I'd made for our own living room and asked if I might make a set for her sunroom. Then her sister asked. Then a woman from church wanted her dining chairs reupholstered, and I taught myself from library books how to strip old frames down to the wood and build them back up properly, with real batting and double-stitched seams that would outlast the furniture itself. By 1991, I had a waiting list 4 months long and a stack of cash tucked under the floorboard of the hall closet that Thomas didn't even know about until our 10th anniversary, when I used it to buy him a good watch and finally told him the truth. By 1994, I had 3 employees and a real workshop, rented space above a hardware store 2 miles from home, and I was driving there most mornings before Nathan woke for school, coming home in time to make dinner and let him believe I'd simply been at the market all day. By 2001, I had a small manufacturing contract with 2 furniture chains in the Midwest, and I was flying, alone, to trade shows in Chicago and High Point, North Carolina, telling Thomas and Nathan I was visiting my sister because some part of me. I've spent years turning this over, and I still don't have a clean answer for it. Did not want the shape of our family life to change while it was still working. I did not want Nathan to grow up watching his mother get picked up in town cars. I wanted him to grow up the way Thomas and I had raised him from the start, believing that dignity and hard work were the only currencies that mattered, and I have never once regretted that decision, even now, even knowing everything I know about how it eventually complicated things. By 2009, after Thomas passed from a heart attack that took him from me in 11 minutes flat on a Tuesday while he was fixing the gutter, I sold 70% of that company to a private equity group for an amount of money that still makes my hands shake a little when I think about the number. I remember sitting in the lawyer's office, signing the final papers, 3 weeks after the funeral, still wearing black, thinking that Thomas would have laughed himself sick at the figure on that page. The particular helpless laugh of a man who had once budgeted our whole Christmas around a $40 bonus. I kept 30%. I kept a seat on the board that I have never once used to draw attention to myself, that I attend twice a year in a gray suit I bought specifically for those 2 days and put back in a garment bag the rest of the time. And every single month, like clockwork, more reliable than my late husband's own heartbeat used to be, $50,000 lands in an account that only my lawyer, my accountant, and I know exists. I still drive a 12-year-old Honda. I still buy my sweaters at the same discount store I have shopped at since 1985. I still clip coupons, not because I need to, but because thrift is not a costume I put on for other people. It is who Thomas and I built together, brick by brick, dollar by dollar, and I was not about to let money change the woman he fell in love with when I was 23 years old and didn't own a single thing worth more than a used sewing machine. My son Nathan doesn't know any of this. He believes his mother lives on a modest pension and the small monthly stipend from some old investment his father made, which is the story I have told him for 17 years, ever since the money started to matter in a way that could change how people looked at me. Nathan is 34 now. He works in commercial real estate, doing reasonably well for himself, though nowhere near what he imagines wealth to look like. He married Claire 3 years ago, a bright, ambitious young woman who works in marketing for a beauty brand and who I have always found pleasant enough, if a little too concerned with appearances for my taste. I never judged her for that. Everyone builds their armor out of something. The pattern started small, the way these things always do. It began about 8 months ago, right around the time Claire's parents announced they were flying in from London for an extended visit. 6 weeks, which struck me as a long time for people I had never met to stay in a country that wasn't their own. But I said nothing, because it was not my business how long anyone's parents wanted to visit. The first thing I noticed was the change in how Nathan spoke to me on the phone. Where he used to call every Sunday evening just to talk, just to tell me about his week, the calls started getting shorter, distracted. He would mention, almost carelessly, things like, Richard and Margaret have a place in the Cotswolds. Mom, you should see the pictures. Or Claire's dad used to run a private equity fund, retired now, but they've got a proper family trust set up for Claire and her sister. I would say, that's nice, sweetheart. And he would move on. But I noticed the way his voice changed when he talked about money that wasn't ours. There was a kind of reverence in it, a kind of hunger, almost, that I hadn't heard in my son's voice before, not even in his 20s when money had actually been tight for him. The second thing I noticed was smaller, but it cut deeper. Claire began referring to my house, my home of 39 years, as cozy, in a tone that made the words sound like an apology. "It's so cozy here, Eleanor," she said the last time she visited, glancing around my living room with its slip-covered sofa and the mismatched lamps Thomas and I had collected over decades, each one with a story behind it that nobody ever asked me to tell. Cozy. As though my home were a problem to be managed rather than a place that had raised a good man, fed 100 Thanksgiving dinners, and held 39 years of a marriage that outshone every luxury apartment I had ever stepped into during business trips, I never told my family about. She said it again 2 weeks later, this time about my kitchen, running a finger along the edge of the counter I'd had resurfaced myself in 2016 with a kit from the hardware store, and I watched her glance at the crack in the linoleum by the back door. A crack I had simply never gotten around to fixing, not because I couldn't, but because Thomas used to catch his sock on that exact spot every winter, and curse good-naturedly. And some part of me had never wanted to erase the last physical trace of that particular joke between us. The third thing was a conversation I wasn't meant to overhear, though I want to be fair and say it wasn't nearly as damning as what would come later. Just Nathan, on the phone in my own kitchen while I was in the pantry looking for the good flour, saying to someone, probably Claire, "I don't know, man. I think Mom's fine. She's just careful with money. Always has been. It's not like there's anything left over from Dad or whatever. Not like there's anything left over." He said it the way you'd mention the weather, with no weight behind it at all, and it stung more than I expected it to. Hearing my own son describe my life in a single flat, incurious sentence, never once wondering if there might be more to the story than he'd assumed since childhood. The fourth thing, the thing that finally made something in me go very still and very quiet, happened on a Tuesday evening when Nathan called and said, almost as an afterthought, right at the end of the conversation, the way people do when they've been building up the courage, the whole call, and finally just blurted out, "Mom, so. Claire's parents are in town starting next month, and we want you to meet them. There's a dinner. It's a nice place, kind of a big deal restaurant, so wear something nice, okay? Wear something nice." As though I had never once in my life sat across a table from a man with more money than sense and negotiated him down 11% on a manufacturing contract without blinking. As though 39 years of building a life from $400 and a mason jar of quarters had left me somehow unequipped to walk into a restaurant with cloth napkins. I did not react to any of it out loud. I have never been a woman who reacts out loud. Thomas used to tease me about it. Ellie could watch the house burn down and just go get more coffee, he'd say. And he wasn't entirely wrong. But inside, something had started turning over, slow and deliberate, the way it does when you've spent your whole life reading a room before anyone else in it even realizes there's something to read. I hung up the phone that night, washed the same coffee mug I'd already washed twice, and stood at my kitchen window for a long time, looking out at the dark yard, feeling the old, familiar sensation of a decision assembling itself somewhere below the level of conscious thought, the way it always used to right before I signed a contract I'd spent months quietly preparing for. The decision came to me not in a single dramatic moment, but the way real decisions usually come, quietly, in the kitchen, while I was drying a coffee mug at 11 o'clock at night and looking out at the dark yard where Thomas used to grow tomatoes. I thought about the years I had spent building that company out of scraps of fabric and stubbornness. I thought about the $50,000 that arrived every month like a tide I never had to check the schedule for. I thought about a woman I had never met, laughing at a joke that hadn't been told yet, deciding in advance what my life was worth based on the cardigan I might wear to dinner. I thought, too, about Thomas, the way I always do when a decision needs weighing. He used to say that the measure of a person wasn't how they treated you when they wanted something, but how they treated you when they were certain you had nothing left to give. He said it the year his own mother was dying, watching cousins who hadn't called her in a decade suddenly appear at her bedside with soft voices and calculating eyes, waiting to hear how the will read. I remember him standing at this very sink, drying his hands on a dish towel, saying, "Ellie, you find out who people really are the moment they think you can't do anything for them anymore." I had never fully understood what he meant until that phone call about the dinner, about wearing something nice, and suddenly, 17 years after burying him, his voice was in my kitchen again, clear as anything, telling me exactly what to do. And I thought, let them. Let them believe whatever they want to believe about me. Let them see the cardigan, the 12-year-old Honda, the coupon folder in my purse. I would not correct a single assumption. Not because I was ashamed of the truth, but because I wanted, needed, really, the way you need air after being underwater too long, to see exactly what kind of family my son was marrying into when they believed there was nothing to be gained from being kind to me. I called my oldest friend the next morning. Dorothy Vance and I have known each other since 1979, when we were both young mothers pushing strollers around the same cracked sidewalk on Larchmont Avenue, comparing notes on colic and sleep schedules and husbands who worked too many hours. We raised our children 2 houses apart. We buried both our husbands within 3 years of each other. Dorothy became a family law attorney later in life, going back to school at 42 when her own children were grown, sitting for the bar exam the same month her youngest left for college, and there is no one on this earth whose judgment I trust more completely. When Thomas died, Dorothy was the one who sat with me at the kitchen table for 6 straight nights, not saying much, just being present, the way only 40 years of friendship allows a person to be present. I told her everything, the calls, the cozy comment, the dinner invitation, the growing unease that had been building in my chest for months like a kettle just before it starts to sing. She listened the way she always does, without interrupting, taking small notes on a legal pad the way she's done since law school, out of habit rather than necessity. "Wear something nice," Dorothy repeated back to me when I got to that part, and I could hear the particular edge in her voice that meant she was already 3 steps ahead of me. "Ellie, do you know what that tells me? It tells me somebody in that family has already decided what you look like before you've even walked in the room. That's not a compliment. That's a diagnosis." "I thought the same thing," I admitted. "What are you going to do?" I told her my idea. The cardigan, the vinyl handbag, the scuffed shoes, letting them believe exactly what they already seemed to believe, just to see how far it would go. Dorothy was quiet for a long moment, and I braced myself for her to talk me out of it, because that is sometimes what a good friend does. Instead, she said, "Good, do it. But you're not doing it unprotected, and you're not doing it alone. I've watched families circle vulnerable elders my entire career, Ellie, and I want to say something to you plainly, because I love you too much to be gentle about it. The fact that you don't need anyone's money doesn't mean you're immune to what people will try when they think you do. Manipulation doesn't require you to actually be poor. It only requires them to believe it. So before you walk into that restaurant, I want your accounts locked down tighter than they already are. I want a fresh look at your will and your trust, and I want you to record everything from here forward. Dates, conversations, anything that feels off, even a little. If you're going to walk into that dinner as a woman with nothing, you'd better walk out of it protected like a woman with everything, because you are one. You make it sound like a war, I said. It's not a war, Dorothy said. It's a fire drill. You hope you never need it. But you build it anyway, because hope was never a legal strategy, and you and I have both buried enough husbands to know that the people who love you and the people who love what you have don't always announce themselves with a name tag. We met 3 days later at her office, a converted Victorian on the edge of downtown with a fig tree in the front yard that she has been nursing along for a decade. Dorothy pulled out my file. Thick, meticulous, the product of 17 years of careful, quiet stewardship. And we went through it line by line. My trust was already airtight, structured years ago, specifically to prevent exactly the kind of situation I might one day face, but Dorothy tightened 2 clauses regarding incapacity determinations as a precaution, just so everything would be current before I walked into that dinner. Just in case, she said, sliding the papers across her desk for my signature. I've seen this movie before, Ellie. Older woman, modest appearance, family assumes there's nothing to protect. I'd rather you have the shield built before you ever need it, even if tonight turns out to be nothing at all. I signed what needed signing, thanked her, and drove home telling myself it probably would turn out to be nothing at all. I was wrong, of course, but I wouldn't know that for another few days yet. The dinner was set for a Friday evening at a restaurant called Averill, the kind of place with no prices on the menu and a maitre d' who says, of course, madam, in a tone that makes you feel like you've already done something wrong. I dressed exactly the way Nathan had, without meaning to, all but instructed me to. A faded cardigan the color of weak tea. A blouse I had owned since 2004. My good shoes, but the good shoes from 15 years ago, scuffed at the toe in a way I could have fixed in about 4 minutes, but chose, very deliberately, not to. I left my nicer handbag at home and carried the vinyl one instead, the one with the broken zipper pull that I keep meaning to replace. I looked, by design, like exactly what they expected. A widow living carefully on very little, grateful for whatever crumbs of attention her son's new family might toss her way. Claire's parents, Richard and Margaret Ashford, were already seated when Nathan and I arrived, and I understood within the first 90 seconds of shaking Richard's hand exactly what kind of evening this was going to be. He had the particular handshake of a man who has spent 40 years deciding, in the first 3 seconds of meeting someone, exactly how much of his attention they deserve. And I watched his eyes do a quick, practiced sweep of my cardigan, my shoes, my handbag, before settling into an expression of polite, distant tolerance. Margaret's greeting was warmer on the surface, all bright teeth and a scent of expensive perfume, but her eyes did the same sweep, just faster, and landed on the same conclusion. So lovely to finally meet Nathan's mother, Margaret said, taking my hand in both of hers the way you might handle something you were afraid could break. Claire has told us so much about you. All good things, I hope, I said, and smiled the smile Thomas used to call my church social smile. Pleasant, small, giving away absolutely nothing. We were seated at a round table near the window, Nathan on my left, Claire directly across from me, her parents flanking her on either side like a matched set of bookends. The menus arrived without prices, and I studied mine with the mild, faintly overwhelmed expression of a woman who wasn't quite sure what half the words meant. Though, of course, I had eaten at finer places than this in 3 different countries during contract negotiations. Thomas never knew the details of. Order whatever you like, Eleanor, Richard said, with the particular generosity of a man who has never once had to think about a restaurant bill in his adult life. This one's on us tonight. Oh, that's very kind, I said, and let my eyes linger just a beat too long on the menu, as though doing quiet arithmetic in my head. I might just have the chicken. I never know what to do with all these French words. Margaret laughed, a light, tinkling sound. It's coq au vin, dear. Chicken and wine. You'll love it. Dinner began the way these dinners always begin, with wine being ordered in a language I understood perfectly well but pretended to find baffling, letting Richard explain, at some length and without being asked, the difference between a Burgundy and a Bordeaux, as though I had never in my life sat across a table from vineyard owners in Napa negotiating supply contracts for upholstery fabric. You see, Eleanor, it's really about the tannins, he said, swirling his glass with the confidence of a man who had learned the gesture from watching other men do it. Bordeaux tends to be more structured, more serious. Burgundy is softer, more approachable, rather like people, if you think about it. He smiled at his own observation as though it were the first time anyone had ever made it. How interesting, I said. I usually just buy whatever's on sale at the grocery store. I'm afraid. Richard's smile flickered, just slightly, the particular flicker of a man recalibrating his estimate of someone downward, and I nodded along, asked a small, uncertain question at exactly the right moment about whether red wine was supposed to be served warm or cold, and watched his chest expand another half-inch with the pleasure of being the expert in the room, correcting me generously, the way you'd correct a child who'd made an understandable mistake. It did not take long for the conversation to turn, the way conversations with people like the Ashfords always eventually turn, toward money. Not directly, never directly, that would be vulgar, but in the coded, glancing way that wealthy people discuss money when they want you to understand your place without ever using an impolite word. Margaret mentioned their house in the Cotswolds, 4 bedrooms and a converted barn Richard used as an office, and then their flat in Chelsea, just something small for when we're in the city. And then, almost as an aside, turning to me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, asked what part of town I lived in. Larchmont Avenue, I said. Same house since 1987. Nothing fancy, but it's paid off, which is more than I can say for a lot of folks. How wonderful, Margaret said, in a tone that made the word wonderful sound like a small, sad thing, the tone you might use to describe a child's drawing that you intended to throw away later. Downsizing must be so freeing, though, isn't it? Claire mentioned you might be looking at one of those retirement communities eventually. So much less to manage, at your age, all alone in a house that size. I had said no such thing to Claire, not once, but I let it sit there, unchallenged, and watched Nathan's face for a reaction. He was looking down at his menu with the particular intensity of a man very much hoping this part of the conversation would end soon, and he did not correct his future mother-in-law's assumption either. I suppose, I said instead, though I do love my garden. I've had the same rose bushes since Nathan was in grade school. You could always get a lovely little patio at one of those communities, Margaret pressed on, warming to the subject now. Claire's aunt is in one outside bath. Meals included, someone to check on you, no stairs to worry about. It really does take such a weight off the family, not having to wonder. Not having to wonder, I repeated, softly, and something in the phrase caught in my chest like a splinter, though I kept my face perfectly mild. The real turn came about 40 minutes into dinner, over the second bottle of wine, when Richard leaned back in his chair with the satisfied air of a man about to say something he considered generous. He set his fork down with a small, deliberate click, the way I imagine he once opened board meetings, and folded his hands. You know, Eleanor, Margaret and I have been thinking. He glanced at his wife, who nodded encouragingly, as though they had rehearsed this. Once the young ones are settled, we'd be more than happy to help set up a little something for you. A modest monthly allowance, nothing extravagant, just enough to make sure you're comfortable in your later years. We'd hate for Nathan to feel burdened, financially, being the only child looking after his mother, especially once he and Claire start thinking about a family of their own. Families should share these responsibilities, don't you think? It's really just good planning. I looked at my son. I watched him look at his plate instead of at me, turning his fork over once, twice, and I felt something in my chest go very cold and very clear, the way ice does right before it cracks. That's incredibly generous of you, I said, keeping my voice soft, keeping my hands folded in my lap, the way a woman who has never negotiated a contract in her life might fold them. I wouldn't want to be a burden to anyone. Oh, you're not a burden, Eleanor, Margaret said quickly, reaching over to pat my hand in a gesture that managed to feel both kind and unbearably condescending at once, the gesture you use on someone you have already, quietly, filed away as a problem to be solved. We just want everyone to be taken care of. It's what family does. And of course, once things are settled financially for you, it would make certain other arrangements so much simpler down the road. For everyone. I did not ask what other arrangements. I already had a fairly good idea. And within the hour, standing behind a wall of white lilies, I would have my answer confirmed in Claire's own voice. I excused myself shortly after, saying I needed to find the powder room, and it was in the hallway just outside it, half hidden by an enormous arrangement of white lilies, that I heard Claire's voice, low and urgent, talking to her mother, who must have followed her out under the same pretense. She's basically got nothing, Mom. The house is falling apart. Nathan says the roof leaks, and she just keeps patching it herself instead of fixing it properly because she can't afford a real repair. That's why we thought if you and Dad set up something for her, small, just enough, then Nathan wouldn't feel like he has to keep dipping into our savings every time something breaks over there. Well, your father's already offered, Margaret said. Did you see her face? I think she's relieved, honestly. Women her age don't like admitting they need help. That's the thing, though, Claire went on, and I heard the particular brisk efficiency in her voice that I imagine she uses when walking a client through a quarterly budget. If we handle it now, gently, over the next few months, I really think we could get her to sign the house over to Nathan early. Avoid all that inheritance mess later, probate, taxes, lawyers, all of it. She trusts him completely. Mom, she'd probably do it if he just asked her the right way, framed it as protecting her, making sure everything's simple for her instead of leaving him with a mess to sort out when she's gone. It's honestly the responsible thing to do. People our parents' age get sentimental about the wrong things. Just be careful, Margaret said, and for one brief, almost hopeful moment, I thought I might hear something like caution, like decency, in her next words. You don't want to seem like you're rushing her. Let your father plant the seed about the allowance first. Once she's comfortable, once she feels looked after, the house conversation will feel like her idea. That's always how these things go smoothest. I stood very still behind that wall of white lilies, my hand pressed flat against the cool plaster, and listened to my son's wife and her mother plan, in hushed and practical voices, exactly how to talk a supposedly poor old woman out of the one asset she believed her mother had left in the world. Not with malice. Exactly. Claire did not sound cruel. She sounded efficient, the way she probably sounded planning a marketing budget, and somehow that was worse. It meant this wasn't a moment of weakness or a single thoughtless remark. It was a plan, workshopped, sequenced, with a first move and a second move already mapped out. And my son's name kept appearing in that sentence, not as someone being protected from a plan, but as someone already positioned inside it. The one who would do the asking. Because she trusts him completely. I went into the powder room, ran the water over my wrists until my hands stopped shaking, and looked at myself in the mirror for a long moment. A 68-year-old woman in a faded cardigan, hair gone fully silver now, the same steady gray eyes that had once stared down a room full of skeptical buyers in High Point and made them sign a contract on my terms. I did not recognize the fear on my own face, because I so rarely let myself feel it, and I stood there until it passed. The way you'd wait out a wave before turning your back to walk out of the ocean. Then I went back out, sat back down at the table, smiled my church social smile, and asked Richard a polite question about his golf game, because I needed the rest of the evening to end without giving anyone a single reason to suspect that anything at all had changed. I ate my chicken. I complimented the wine I hadn't actually tasted much of. I let Nathan walk me to my car afterward. Hug me goodnight. Tell me he loved me. And I hugged him back and told him I loved him too, because it was true, and because some things remained true even in the middle of everything else. But everything had changed. I drove home that night with the windows cracked, despite the cold, because I needed the air moving to keep my thoughts from settling into something bitter. Bitterness has never suited me. Thomas used to say I had a talent for turning hurt into strategy instead of letting it curdle, and I sat in my driveway for a long while before going inside, running the numbers of my own life against the numbers I'd just overheard. 39 years in that house, 22 years watching Thomas come home smelling of machine oil. 17 years of $50,000 a month that not one person in my family had ever thought to ask about, because they had already decided, long before that dinner, that there was nothing left to ask about. I went inside, hung up my coat, and sat at the kitchen table until nearly 1 in the morning, not crying, just thinking the way I think best, slowly and without an audience. The counter move took me 11 days to put fully into place, and I moved through those 11 days with the same quiet, methodical focus I used to bring to closing a difficult manufacturing deal. First, I called Dorothy and told her everything I'd overheard, word for word, as close as I could remember it. She was quiet for a long moment on the phone, and then she said, in the flat, careful voice she uses when she's genuinely angry but professionally restraining herself, "Well, now we know exactly what we're dealing with. Come in Monday. And Ellie, bring the article, the one from the Business Journal. I have a feeling you're going to want it sooner than you think." We spent that Monday morning restructuring my estate plan entirely. I removed Nathan as sole beneficiary of the house and placed it instead into an irrevocable trust that would pass, upon my death, into a scholarship fund for young women starting small businesses out of their homes. The exact kind of business I had once built out of a garage with a broken sewing machine and a stubborn streak. I named it, on a whim that surprised even me, the Thomas and Eleanor Whitfield Fund, because it seemed right that his name should still be doing some good in the world. One small grant at a time, to women who reminded me of who I used to be. Nathan would still inherit, generously, from the larger financial estate he had no idea existed, but the house. The one thing they believed to be my only asset, the thing they were maneuvering to extract from me while I was still alive and, in their minds, too naive to notice, would never touch their hands. Dorothy also helped me set up a formal, documented gift structure for Nathan's actual inheritance, one with clear provisions that would trigger full disclosure and forfeiture of certain benefits if any attempt was made to coerce, pressure, or manipulate me into signing over property while I was alive. "Belt and suspenders," Dorothy said, sliding the papers across for my signature. "You've earned the right to be thorough, Ellie. Most people your age who built what you built spent their whole lives being underestimated by men in boardrooms. It would be a shame to let yourself be underestimated by your own dining room table instead." I laughed at that, the first real laugh I'd managed in almost 2 weeks, and signed everything twice. Once for the file, once for the fireproof box in my closet that only Dorothy and I know the combination to. Second, I quietly withdrew $20,000 from one of my accounts and had it wired into a separate, newly opened account under my full legal name, Eleanor Marguerite Whitfield, along with a full statement history from the last 3 years, printed and organized, showing 36 consecutive months of $50,000 deposits from Whitfield Textile Holdings, the company I still hold. 30% of the company whose board I still quietly sit on twice a year in a conference room none of my family has ever set foot in. Third, and this was the part that took the most courage, I called Nathan and told him I wanted to host dinner myself at my house the following Sunday. Just the 4 of us, Nathan, Claire, and her parents, since Richard and Margaret were still in town for another 2 weeks. "I know it's not fancy like Averil," I told him on the phone, letting my voice carry the exact note of humble apology they would expect from a woman in my supposed position. "But I'd love to have everyone over. I'll make my pot roast." "Mom, you really don't have to go to the trouble," Nathan said, and I could hear, underneath the words, something that might have been guilt, or might have simply been embarrassment at the thought of the Ashfords sitting at my worn kitchen table. "It's no trouble at all, sweetheart," I said. "I want to." I spent that week preparing, but not the way they expected. I did make the pot roast. Thomas's favorite recipe, the one I could make blindfolded. But I also spent 2 full days on the phone with my accountant, my lawyer, and, for the first time in nearly a decade, the marketing director at Whitfield Textile Holdings, a bright young woman named Priscilla, who had never met me in person and seemed faintly delighted to discover the company's quiet, mysterious. Minority shareholder was a 68-year-old widow who still answered her own phone. I arranged for a single framed magazine feature to be reprinted and delivered to my house by Friday afternoon. A profile from a regional business journal, 7 years old now, with a photograph of me standing in front of the company's original warehouse, hard hat tucked under one arm, the headline reading, "The Quiet Empire, How One Widow Built a Manufacturing Powerhouse from a Garage." I had never once hung that article anywhere in my house. It had lived, folded, in the same fireproof box as my trust documents for 7 years because I had never needed anyone to see it. I also called my bank and requested a printed statement history, 36 months, showing the deposits exactly as they'd arrived, month after month after month, and I tucked it into a plain manila folder alongside the framed article and a copy of the original 2009 sale agreement. Thomas's name still listed as a beneficiary on the very first page, because the lawyers hadn't finished the paperwork. Before he passed, and I had never had the heart to ask them to remove him, I laid all of it on the hall table by the front door, covered with a dish towel, the way you might leave a covered casserole dish waiting for the right moment to be uncovered. On Thursday night, I stood in front of my bedroom mirror and tried on the good navy dress I hadn't worn since a board dinner 2 years earlier, the one with the small gold buttons, and I looked at myself for a long time. Silver hair, steady eyes, the same woman who had negotiated with vineyard owners and furniture executives and never once needed anyone's permission to take up space in a room. Then I hung the dress back in the closet and put the faded cardigan back on its hook by the cardigan's usual spot, ready for one more Sunday, because the reveal, when it came, needed to happen exactly the way everything else in this story had happened, quietly, on my own terms, in my own home, wearing whatever I chose to wear. Sunday came, warm and bright, the kind of late spring afternoon that makes a modest brick house look almost golden if the light hits it right. I set my table with the same mismatched dishes I've used for 30 years, laid out my pot roast and mashed potatoes and green beans the way I always have, and waited in my kitchen, wearing the same faded cardigan, for my family to arrive and discover exactly who had been sitting across the table from them the entire time. They arrived at 6. Nathan first, carrying a bottle of wine and looking faintly anxious in a way that told me some part of him already sensed something was different about the air in the house tonight. Claire followed, glancing around my living room with the same practiced, careful neutrality she always brought into spaces she considered beneath her. Richard and Margaret came last, Richard commenting, not unkindly but not warmly either, on how charming the neighborhood was, the same way you might describe a photograph of a place you'd never actually choose to live. I let everyone settle at the table. I let the pot roast be served, the wine poured. A bottle I'd bought at the grocery store, on sale, and I made a point of mentioning that when Richard complimented it, watching his eyebrows lift in polite surprise. I let the small talk unfold about their flight home in 2 weeks, Claire's work, the weather, Nathan mentioning a listing he'd closed that week, Margaret asking a few more careful questions about my garden, my rose bushes, whether I managed the yard work myself these days or had someone come in to help. Oh, I managed just fine, I told her, and let her draw whatever conclusion she liked from that. I waited until the plates were half empty and the second glass of wine had loosened everyone's shoulders. Waited until the conversation had drifted into the comfortable lull that always comes about 40 minutes into a family dinner when people stop performing quite so hard and start simply existing at the table together. Then I got up, walked to the hall table by the front door, and came back carrying the manila folder and the framed article, both still covered by the dish towel. I set them down beside my plate, sat back down, folded my hands on the table the way I had 11 days earlier in that restaurant, and said, quietly, I want to tell you all a story. It won't take long. The table went still. Nathan looked up first, something wary already moving behind his eyes. 39 years ago, my husband Thomas and I bought this house with $400 in savings. I started sewing curtains in the garage to help make ends meet, because a factory foreman's salary and a young family don't leave much room for anything extra. That little business grew, slowly, over years of very hard work, into something called Whitfield Textile Holdings. By the time I sold most of it, it employed over 200 people across 3 states. In 2009, the year Thomas passed, I sold 70% of that company. I kept 30% and a seat on the board, and every single month for the last 17 years, I have received a payment of $50,000 from that company. That is $600,000 a year, arriving like clockwork into an account that until this very moment, none of you knew existed. I looked around the table slowly, meeting each set of eyes in turn. Richard's, Margaret's, Claire's, and finally my son's. I have never told a single member of this family because I did not want money to change how anyone looked at me, and because your father and I built our whole marriage on the belief that character matters more than circumstance. I still believe that. I believed it especially at Avril, 3 weeks ago, when I decided to test it. I pulled the dish towel off the folder and the frame and set them both in the middle of the table, turning the framed article so it faced outward, toward Richard and Margaret. The photograph looked back at all of us. A younger version of me, 40-some years old maybe, standing in front of a warehouse in a hard hat, unmistakably myself, despite the decades between that picture and this table. I opened the folder and slid the bank statements across the tablecloth. 36 months of deposits laid out in neat, undeniable rows. I let that sit in the room. Margaret's wine glass stopped halfway to her mouth, her eyes moving from the photograph to the numbers to my face and back again, as though she were trying to make the three things add up into something that made sense. Richard's expression flickered, just once, something calculating passing quickly behind his eyes before he smoothed it back into practiced neutrality. The same recalibration I'd watched him perform at Averill, except running in the opposite direction this time. Claire had gone very pale, one hand pressed flat against the tablecloth as though she needed something solid to hold on to. I want to be clear, I continued, my voice still soft, still even, that I am not telling you this to shame anyone or to punish anyone. I am telling you this because 11 days ago, at Averill, I stood behind a wall of white lilies outside the powder room and heard Claire tell her mother, in a very calm and organized voice, that my house was falling apart, that I had nothing, and that if the two of you handled it gently, you could probably talk me into signing my only asset over to Nathan early to avoid the mess of an inheritance, and save everyone a little money on lawyers and taxes. I heard my son's name mentioned as part of that plan, not as someone objecting to it, but as someone already discussing it. Eleanor, I. Margaret started, but I held up a hand, gently, the way you'd quiet a room without raising your voice, and she stopped. I let you all believe I was exactly what you expected me to be, I said. A poor widow in a faded cardigan, grateful for a modest monthly allowance from people who had decided, within 90 seconds of meeting me, exactly how much I was worth. I wanted to see what kind of family my son was marrying into when they believed there was nothing to be gained from being kind to me. And now I know. Richard set down his fork with a small, controlled click. Now, Eleanor, I think there's been some misunderstanding here. We only ever wanted to help. Richard, I said, and something in my voice must have changed because he stopped immediately. I built a company from a garage with a broken sewing machine. I have negotiated contracts with men far more polished than you, and I have watched every single one of them underestimate me exactly once. I don't need your help. I never did. What I needed, tonight, was to understand who was sitting at my son's table. Claire had started to cry, quietly, her hand pressed against her mouth, and I want to tell you that this is the moment in the story where I felt something like triumph, but that isn't quite true. What I felt was tired and a little bit sad. The way you feel when a suspicion you had hoped was wrong turns out to be exactly right. Mom, Nathan said, and his voice cracked on the word in a way I hadn't heard since he was 19 years old and calling to tell me he'd wrecked his first car. Mom, I swear, I didn't. It wasn't like that. I never agreed to. You didn't stop it either, Nathan, I said, and I kept my voice gentle. Because underneath everything, he is still my son, and some part of a mother never stops wanting to soften the blow, even when the blow is deserved. You sat at that table and let Richard offer me an allowance like I was a charity case, and you didn't say a word. You let Claire tell her mother my roof was falling apart because it was easier than telling her the truth, which is that I've never once asked you for $1 in your entire adult life, and I never intended to start. The reckoning, when it came, split the table into exactly the shapes I had expected, though the specifics still surprised me. Richard recovered fastest, the way men like him always do, sliding smoothly into a kind of brisk, business-minded apology that wasn't really an apology at all. Well, this certainly puts things in a different light, doesn't it? No harm done, I'm sure. We can just consider that whole conversation at the restaurant retracted. As though the harm had been a miscommunication about a dinner reservation, rather than a calculated plan to strip an old woman of her home. He even attempted, at one point, a small laugh, glancing around the table for someone to join him in finding the whole evening amusing now that the facts had rearranged themselves in my favor. No one laughed with him. He picked his fork back up a moment later and returned to his pot roast, as though the matter were now, for all practical purposes, closed. Margaret said very little after that, staring at her plate, occasionally glancing at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, somewhere between embarrassment and something that might, if I was generous, have been the beginning of shame. Once, quietly, while Richard was still talking, she said, almost to herself, The retirement community comment. I said that thinking I was being helpful. I didn't respond because I wasn't certain yet whether she believed that or simply needed to say it out loud to someone. Claire broke completely, in the way that people do when the version of themselves they've been telling a comfortable story about suddenly cracks open in front of witnesses. I didn't mean it the way it sounded, she said, through tears that I believed were at least partly genuine. Nathan said things were tight for you, and I thought if my parents helped, it would take some pressure off him, off us, and the house thing. I don't know. It just seemed practical. It wasn't supposed to be. I never thought of it as taking anything from you, Eleanor, I swear. I believed that Claire believed that. I think that's often the most dangerous kind of harm. The kind done by people who have simply never had to ask themselves whether their practicality might be someone else's loss. Nathan was the one who surprised me. He didn't defend himself the way I expected him to, the way his younger self might have, with excuses and deflection. Instead, he sat very still for a long moment, his jaw working, and then he said, quietly, to the whole table, "She's right." I heard the same conversation, more or less, weeks ago, and I didn't shut it down because some part of me thought, I don't know what I thought, that it would be easier, that Mom wouldn't mind, because Mom never minds anything. She just absorbs it and keeps going. And I think I've been taking advantage of that my whole life without ever calling it that. He looked at me, and his eyes were wet in a way that reminded me, painfully, of the boy who used to cry over broken toys and skinned knees. "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry. Not because you're rich. Because I let people talk about you like you were something to manage instead of someone to protect, and that's true whether you have $50 or $50,000. I let that sit in the room for a moment because it was, of everything said that evening, the only sentence that felt entirely true. The dinner ended not long after, quietly, the Ashfords making their exit with the strained politeness of people whose calculations had all gone wrong at once. Claire lingered at the door, and before she left, she turned back and said, "I'd like to understand you better, Eleanor, if you'll let me." I told her that I would like that too, and I meant it, though I made no promises about how quickly trust rebuilds itself once it's been shown to have cracks. Nathan stayed after everyone else had gone, helping me clear the table the way he used to when he was a boy too young yet to understand what any of it cost, scraping plates into the trash, running water until it went warm, stacking things in the drying rack the way I'd taught him decades ago. We didn't talk much while we worked. At one point, he picked up the framed article, turning it over in his hands, studying the photograph of me in the hard hat for a long moment. "You look happy in this picture," he said quietly. "I don't think I've ever seen you look quite like that." "I was happy," I told him. "Building something with your father's name on the paperwork, even after he was gone." I think some part of me needed to prove I could keep the thing alive without him. When the dishes were done, he sat back down at the kitchen table, in the same chair Thomas used to sit in, and he said, "I don't even know what to say to you right now." "You don't have to say anything tonight," I told him. "You said the important part already." He was quiet for a while, turning his water glass slowly on the table. $50,000 a month, he said, almost to himself. "Mom, why didn't you ever tell me?" I thought about that question for a long moment before I answered, because it deserved a real answer, not a quick one. Because your father and I built our whole life on the idea that who you are isn't the same thing as what you have, I said. I wanted you to grow up understanding the value of a dollar you earned yourself, not one that fell into your lap because your mother happened to sew a good curtain 40 years ago. And if I'm honest with you, Nathan, some part of me was always a little afraid of what would happen if people knew. I've watched money change rooms my whole life. I've watched it change the way people look at each other. I didn't want it to change the way you looked at me. "It doesn't," he said. "It never would have. I just wish I'd known sooner, so I could have. I don't know, been better." "Sooner? You're being better now," I said. "That counts for more than you think." He was quiet again for a while, turning the water glass slowly, and then he said, almost to himself, "Dad would be so embarrassed of me right now. Your father was never a man who held grudges over one bad evening," I said. "He'd be more interested in what you do next than what happened at that restaurant. That's all any of us can really offer each other, sweetheart. Not a perfect record, just what we do next." I reached across the table and covered his hand with mine, the way I used to when he was small and frightened of something in the dark. "You have always been a good son, Nathan. Tonight doesn't erase that. It just means there's a part of being a good man you still have to grow into, the part where you protect people even when it costs you something. Your father learned that the hard way too, a long time before you were born. I have faith you'll get there faster than he did. How do you know? He asked. Because you drove home tonight instead of calling me tomorrow to smooth things over, I said. That's not nothing. That's a start. 3 weeks later, the Ashfords flew home to London. I did not see them again before they left, though Nathan told me Richard had asked him, somewhat sheepishly, to pass along an invitation for me to visit the Cotswolds house sometime, whenever it's convenient. I have not decided yet whether I will go. Some bridges, once you've seen exactly how much weight they were never built to hold, take longer to trust again than others, even after they've been repaired. Claire and I had coffee, just the two of us, about a month after that Sunday dinner. She arrived early to the little cafe near my house, and I could tell by the way she kept turning her cup in small circles that she'd rehearsed what she wanted to say. I've been thinking a lot about why I did that, she told me, not offering excuses this time, just trying, I think, to actually understand herself. I think I grew up watching my parents manage people the way you'd manage an investment portfolio, and it never occurred to me that there was another way to think about family until I watched you sit at that table and just tell the truth, calmly, without needing to punish anyone for it. I want to be better at that, at just being honest instead of being efficient. I told her I believed she could be, and that belief costs me nothing to offer and might cost her everything to earn, which felt like a fair trade to propose. Nathan has changed the most, or perhaps he has simply returned to who he was before ambition and other people's expectations started reshaping him one careless comment at a time. He calls every Sunday again, the full hour, no distraction in his voice. He came by 2 weekends ago and fixed that crack in the kitchen linoleum himself, on his knees on my kitchen floor with a putty knife. Not because I asked him to, but because, he said, I noticed it's been there a long time, Mom, and I figured it was time somebody finally took care of it instead of just working around it. I did not tell him about the sock, and the joke, and the version of Thomas that lived in that crack for 15 years. Some things you let go of when the moment is finally right. And that afternoon, watching my son smooth fresh grout into the seam his father used to catch his sock on, felt like exactly the right moment. There is a kind of wisdom that only comes from watching people reveal themselves when they believe nothing is at stake, and I have carried that wisdom with me every day since that dinner. I learned, at 68 years old, sitting behind a wall of white lilies in a restaurant hallway, that character is not what people show you when they think you might be useful to them. Character is what people show you when they believe you have nothing left to offer, when the calculation in their head has already concluded that kindness toward you carries no return on investment. That is the moment the truth walks into the room, whether you invited it or not. I have thought a great deal, too, about the difference between generosity and strategy and how easily one can disguise itself as the other if you aren't paying close enough attention. Richard's offer of an allowance was never generosity. It was a hedge, a way to control a variable he believed was a liability to his daughter's new family, dressed up in the language of care so that refusing it would have felt, to anyone watching, like ingratitude rather than self-respect. Real generosity doesn't come with a plan attached to extract something in return 5 years down the line. It simply gives and lets go, the way I have tried to give and let go of my son his whole life, even when it would have been easier, in that moment at the restaurant, to simply announce who I was and watch everyone's posture change in real time, the way I've watched posture change in 100 boardrooms, the instant someone learns what a person is actually worth. I think, too, about how close I came to never testing any of it at all, to simply accepting the cardigan comments, the cozy remarks, the quiet assumption that a woman my age with a paid-off house and a modest wardrobe had nothing left to protect and nothing left to prove. It would have been easier, in some ways, to let it go. But easier is not the same as right, and I did not spend 39 years building a life out of scrap fabric and stubbornness only to spend my last decades letting people write my story for me because they never thought to ask if I'd already written it myself, years ago, in a garage, with my own 2 hands. If you are listening to this tonight, and some part of you recognizes yourself in me, a woman who has been underestimated, quietly assessed, and found wanting by people who never bothered to ask a single real question about who you are, I want you to hear this clearly. You do not owe anyone the truth about your own worth simply because they've decided, based on your cardigan or your car or your zip code, what that worth must be. Sometimes the wisest thing you can do is let people show you exactly who they are while they still believe you're not paying attention. And when they do, when the mask slips and you see clearly what was underneath it all along, you will already know exactly what to do with that information because you have spent your whole life, the same as I have, learning how to survive quietly and act decisively, all without ever raising your voice. I am not angry anymore, if you're wondering. I was, for a little while, in the days right after that dinner at Averill, and I think that anger was fair, and I don't regret feeling it. But anger is a poor place to build a house, and I have never in my life been the kind of woman who built anything poorly. What I have instead, now, is clarity. About my son, about the family he's building, about the quiet, unglamorous strength it takes to stay soft-spoken while the people around you decide, wrongly, that soft-spoken means small. It never has. It never will. I was never a small woman in a faded cardigan. I was only ever waiting for the right moment to remind everyone, gently, of exactly who had been sitting at the table with them all along. Sometimes I think about how differently that whole evening might have unfolded if I had simply walked into Averill in the navy dress with the gold buttons, if I had let Richard see, from the very first handshake, exactly the kind of woman he was dealing with. I think he would have been perfectly charming. I think Margaret would have complimented my earrings instead of my cozy house. I think the allowance would never have been offered, because you do not offer an allowance to a woman who might quietly outbid you on your own summer house if she felt like it. And I think I would have gone the rest of my life never knowing what I know now, never hearing the plan whispered behind a wall of white lilies, never watching my son's face when he finally understood what he'd allowed to happen at his own engagement dinner. The cardigan cost me nothing. What it bought me was the truth. And at 68 years old, I have come to understand that the truth, however uncomfortable, is always worth more than the comfortable version of events that money can otherwise buy you. I planted new rose bushes this spring, right along the back fence where Thomas used to grow his tomatoes. Nathan helped me dig the holes. Claire came by one afternoon and asked if she could learn to reupholster an old chair she'd found at an estate sale. And I said yes, and we spent 3 hours in my garage together, the same garage where all of this began 40 years ago, her hands slowly learning what mine already knew. Some bridges rebuild themselves faster than you expect, once both people are finally willing to stand on solid ground instead of the version of each other they'd assumed was true. If this story stayed with you, I would love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me, what would you have done in my place? And from where in the world are you listening? I read every message, and you mean more to me than you know. For more stories like this one, like this video, and subscribe. There is so much more waiting for you. With love and respect. Until next time, I still drive the same 12-year-old Honda. I still clip coupons on Sunday mornings with my coffee. Not out of necessity, but out of habit and out of respect for the woman who taught herself to sew curtains in a garage because that was the only path available to her at the time. Money never changed that woman. It only ever gave her the resources to protect what she'd already built, one quiet, deliberate decision at a time. That is the only inheritance I ever really wanted to leave behind. Not the number in the account, but the proof that dignity, patience, and a willingness to wait for the truth will outlast every assumption anyone ever makes about a woman in a faded cardigan.